Hi, everybody. So last week I asked the question, what happens when schools reopen from this coronavirus crisis? We're in the middle of so many changes in such a short time of how teachers teach, how students are learning, and even the external circumstances surrounding a lot of our lessons. So, for those of you who don't know, my name is Scott Benzenberg. I've been working in international education as a secondary school teacher for about 10 years. I'm currently teaching in Norway, and I'm also working on an MBA program based out of Finland. And so I think there's really important insights that the Finnish educational model can bring to our sort of work with coronavirus and the way that students and teachers are responding. So last week I asked the question, what happens or what will happen when schools reopen, and now I want to investigate some things that could happen in a perfect world. How could we take some of the lessons and the circumstances surrounding this environment, the way that teachers and learners are working, and apply that maybe going forward? And I think there are maybe three really important lessons that I hope we could learn from this time, and it's certainly been a really reflective time. I know from a lot of educators and administrators around the world. And so the three things that I want to focus on in the next couple of weeks, I'll go a little bit more in depth, are this issue of trust, how are we using time and space in schools, and also something called double loop learning, which I think is a really important concept, which could really shape the way that we're thinking about taking lessons from this experience as educators. I want to maybe first of all talk a little bit about this issue of trust, because it becomes such an important feature, at least in the work that I've been doing, and also hearing from colleagues around the world to a greater or lesser extent how the trust is working in their environment. So I can share a little bit about my experience here at an international school in Norway. The director of our school gathered us in right before we were about to close for, indefinitely. And he communicated very clearly about the expectations, about the ways we'd be working, the kinds of communications that we would have. But he ended the staff meeting with a really important note, which was that he trusted us as professionals, and that we weren't going to be having someone look over our shoulders and making sure that everything we were doing was, exactly how we would do it in a normal circumstance. And as a response, there's been so much collaboration, so much really good creative thinking in terms of how teachers at this organization are working. And I think we've been a lot more willing to put in the additional time and energy because we have this trust. I want to link this back to my experience working in this MBA program out of Finland. As part of the program, we had the opportunity to visit lots of schools in the area. And one thing that came up again and again was this idea that things were working. We hear so much about the Finnish educational model in the international environment. And I think what we don't necessarily understand is that it's mostly a byproduct of trust in so many different kinds of directions. First of all, there's a big cultural context of trust, I think, that's difficult to appreciate unless you're maybe working there for an extended period of time. And so this trust really shapes the way that educators work, what they feel responsible for, how they're assessed from their administrators, but also that works on the student level. And so in this environment of Corona time, if that's what we want to call it, one of the things that I think has been really interesting is by necessity, we've had to be given lots of trust from our administrators, from parents. And in return, I find myself trusting students to get things done in a way that I wouldn't maybe traditionally. But the trust is a little bit more than that. I mean, we're seeing these big external examination boards sort of trusting the administrators at local schools to say, okay, well, your curriculum model is sufficient, so you can determine the grades for these graduating seniors. Or similarly, I think universities are going to have to trust that these, the internal reports are they reflect good teaching practice. And in return, that has really created an environment of freedom, of innovation. So I wonder how this is going to shape out in the future. And I want to investigate that in some future videos to think about what is it that we need from each level of the educational organization, from administration, from teaching, from students, from parents, and also from the external environments, from these examination boards or from universities. How does trust play a role in that, and how can we maybe work with that, having had this experience that a lot of these old models don't necessarily fit in this environment of Corona and our crisis response? A second big issue that's come up, and I think we might be able to take forward as we return to something like normalcy, is this question about how we're using time and space in the classroom. One of the most liberating things in my personal experience is that my lesson plan is based on the amount of curriculum that I think is reasonable to cover. I mean, that's always true, but now I'm not asking myself also, does that also fit within an 80-minute time block? So I can structure the way I organize my lessons in my weekly or even monthly curriculum in a way that allows students to attain maybe more levels of mastery, rather than also thinking about how it fits in with a timetable. And for me, this idea of time is going to be something that I really hope we investigate further. I'm thinking specifically at secondary school level. Our traditional timetable may not reflect the best teaching practice. And I want to maybe shed some of my experience from the Finnish model here as well. I remember we visited a Finnish elementary school, and this was specifically talking about how the classrooms were designed and how the teachers and students would interact. But the principal of the school said, it used to be the case that when a student was not behaving or didn't understand the material, that's when they'd be sent outside of the room. And, the so-called good students or the behaving students would be the ones inside. He said, well, that model, we can flip that. Of course, not talking about good and bad behavior, but the students who really understand the concept, they can go off and do it on their own. And the students who need some additional support, stay behind, stay inside the classroom. And this whole concept has been really the defining feature of my experience with virtual teaching and learning, which has been that students who need some additional time, I'm here, I'm in the virtual meet. For the rest of you, you can go off. You've got until our next meeting on Wednesday, for example, to finish the assignment. But I'm here, you know where I'll be, pop in and out. This has really allowed, I think, some students who are really high achieving to go off and do really more interesting creative things that are maybe extending their own knowledge, and students who still have some questions, they're a little less reluctant to stay behind and say one-to-one on a sort of virtual environment, ask a particular question. And I'm actually much better able to diagnose things. We're not thinking about time, and we're not thinking about the amount of content that needs to be covered in this 80-minute block. And lastly, I think this is fundamental to however we choose to move forward. In the coming weeks, I also want to talk about this idea of double loop learning. So often when we have staff meetings or when we make discussion, ideas in a staff meeting, we are talking about solving a particular problem for a particular moment. But since so much has changed so rapidly in this environment, I think it's an opportunity for us to re-examine our underlying values and beliefs. And I know as teachers, that's something we do. As administrators, it's something that happens all the time. But I think in a really profound way, we have an opportunity to really test and see whether or not the assumptions that we have about what education is or must be, and I'm thinking specifically about external examinations or university entrance kinds of questions, whether or not those assumptions still hold true, or they need to hold true, or there might be some way we can develop further from that. And I want to return here lastly before I end this segment of the video is back to this idea of the Finnish educational model. And I think sometimes in the media, it gets translated like the Finnish educational system is this wildly innovative program full of all of these kinds of, creative teaching practices that are beyond the... It's not really like that exactly. Of course, there's opportunities for innovation, but I want to return to a quotation from another school principal who sat us down and said, one of the things that it's important to note is we're not throwing away books, using textbooks, just because it's something that's old. But at the same time, we do look for ways to improve and develop. And I think that this isn't maybe an important strategy or way of approaching the future of education. We've just had this moment. We're in the middle of this moment. But that doesn't mean that everything has to be uprooted. At the same time, we, I think, do need to have a really honest conversation about those assumptions that we're making about what education is doing and what we need to have in place. Because as we're seeing in a different kind of environment with time and space, being able to trust out of necessity, there's a lot of opportunities that are helping to, I think, push good teaching practice forward in a really short period of time. So thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm going to continue talking about these three issues and more. I'm also really looking forward to announcing, I'm announcing it here, a podcast called Connected, which is going to sort of share inspiring stories of educational leadership. So please go ahead and subscribe to that. I look forward to sharing that with you. Thanks again.